It's a big shock when you go home. I mean, you know, I had a very senior position. You know, I was earning about £100,000 a year, and you go from 100,000 to nothing. You know, I had a mortgage. I had a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, and my wife. You know, it was pretty hard to, you know, to come home and say, well, everything's suddenly come to a shuddering stop, and you have, you know, there's no reason for it. You know, you're just, you know, and people do think, well, you know, people wouldn't treat you like this. I think that's the thing that whistleblowers have in common, actually. You know, whether it's Steve Bolson or me or people in care homes or whatever, when you get together, you realise that people do behave like this. Because I think people who are more distant from it think, well, there must be something behind it. You know, and it changes the way you look at things, because you realise organisations are about power at the end of the day. People have power, they don't want to surrender that. They're not looking for people to come along and say what they're doing is wrong. You see it all the time. You see lots of scandals that are exposed, and most of them are exposed because someone's brave enough to stand up and say what's going on. But people don't want you to be rocking the boat if it means at the end of the day it's them that will be looking to have their income drop to zero. But it is quite difficult. In October 2001, that's when things suddenly started to go wrong. There was a young lady in the information department which came under my control, and she was being told by the Deputy Chief Executive that she should alter the number of cancelled operations that were going through the hospital to zero, when over a 3-week period when she was recording these figures, we had 81 cancelled operations taking place. She was concerned because at that time Alan Milburn was Secretary of State for Health, and because Labour government had come in and they were saying how great, you know, the health service was, and there was a lot of speculation in the media that figures were being manipulated, that a lot of things were going wrong, but actually with all the spin that was going on with the Labour government then, people were altering the figures. And he made a very clear statement at the time that he said, well, that's not the case, and if we find anyone who's you know, fiddling figures, they'll be dismissed from the NHS. So understandably, this young lady was, you know, concerned. She was a young graduate, hadn't been working there very long. So she reported it to her manager that she'd been told to alter these statistics. The manager reported to the head of information that there was a problem, and the head of information reported to me because I was the board executive responsible for information and computing. My next action was to report that to the chief executive, and that's when my problems really started. He was extremely defensive. And he said, well, if the Deputy Chief Executive was doing that, there was a good reason for it. And he said the Deputy Chief Executive's response was that the systems that produced the information about how many cancelled operations there were was faulty, and that therefore he thought it best to put in zero rather than the number of operations that have been cancelled. Now, these are operations that are cancelled, you know, within 24 hours notice of when someone's going to be operated on. So it might just seem like a statistical thing, but you imagine if you're coming in, you know, for your cancer operation or a very serious surgical procedure, it's quite traumatic when you've built yourself up for it. Most people are extremely nervous, you know, they need to be relaxed when they come in for their treatment. They might have been waiting a long time before they actually got to that position. So to be told when you've sort of geared yourself up, made all your arrangements so that, you know, you're going to be out of action for a while with your family and your job or your business, to suddenly be told that operation is cancelled can be a, you know, pretty traumatic experience for individuals. And so what I did was, because it was said that the figures weren't correct, I had a full audit done by the head of information, who assured me that the information was being correctly recorded, and we really had these operations cancelled in the hospital. What then transpired was there was a meeting of all the of my fellow executive directors on the board, and we decided that in future we would change the arrangements for reporting this so that these sorts of changes couldn't be made by the Deputy Chief Executive in future, and I took responsibility for bringing those figures forward. But I then found that the chief nurse, for instance, wrote to me and said she found that it was very disappointing that I'd raised this issue in the first place. And I was called to a meeting with the chairman of the trust, a woman called Catherine McLaughlin, who told me that my actions had caused a great amount of dissension and disharmony amongst board colleagues by, flagging this up. And so, I was quite surprised by this reaction, because the NHS always says that, it prides itself on people can be open, tell the truth, and these things shouldn't be happening. No action was taken against the Deputy Chief Executive, and I was quite worried by the reaction that, that I got. The chairman of the trust, in fact, said, "I'll tell you what the problem with this trust is. It's you and your damn arrogance, for raising this kind of issue." When my troubles really started was in July 2002, the following year, because on I think it was about July the 25th, at that point they were talking about NHS trusts becoming foundation trusts, and what they said was that you had to, at that time, there were 8 what they called star ratings that you had to achieve. One of those was how many cancelled operations you had. And on the 25th of July, St George's Hospital, the star ratings, it said they'd passed in 7 categories, but they had failed in 1, which was the cancelled operation statistics, which of course I had made sure was being correctly reported. That was on the 25th of July. I was actually on holiday with my family at the time. And when I came into the office on the 29th of July, as I was driving in, my PA rang me and said the Chief Executive and the Director of HR want to see you urgently. Well, I had no idea, what it was about. I knew they weren't acting generally as they should. Anyway, I went straight up to their office, and I went in, sat down, and they said they wanted to talk to me as old friends. That immediately started alarm bells ringing, because they clearly weren't old friends of mine, they were professional colleagues. And they said to me that I had been upsetting too many senior people in the NHS with things that I had been doing and saying, and that what they had decided was that I should accept 3 months secondment to the London regional headquarters of the NHS, and that if I went there, I wouldn't actually have to go and do any work. I could actually stay at home, treat it as gardening leave. But then at the end of that period, I would have found another job, and then I could move on, and they said they would write me a good reference and we'd all part friends. When I said, well, why should I do that? I enjoy my job, I've done nothing wrong, why should I do that? They said, well, if you don't, then we're going to, initiate disciplinary proceedings against you, and we'll fire you out of the organisation. And you won't be able to get a job again when we blacken your character. So being the sort of person that I am, I said, well, you'll have to do your worst then. I said, because you'll have to fire me right now, because I'm going back to my office to do my job. They then asked me to wait, and they said they were going outside to ring their legal advisors. So they went outside. They came back about 10 minutes later and said to me, okay, I could still stay working in the organisation, but they didn't want me to attend any meetings as Director of Finance. I could go back to my office, work with my department, but I was no longer to represent the organisation. So anyway, I went back to my office and then got in touch with my legal advisor. I didn't actually have one at the time, but I was a trade unionist. So I got in touch with my trade union. This came as a complete surprise to me. I went home and told my wife that, what was happening. She was absolutely sort of thunderstruck, because, by that time I'd had a successful career for over 26 years. I'd only ever been promoted. I'd never had any complaints. I'd won, only about 8 months earlier, well in May, so it was only 4 months earlier, I'd won a National Employment Award for my department. So I mean, you're winning national awards, and then a few months later, you're being told you're going to be out on your ear. So it's a bit surprising. The other thing, which I found amazing, was the rules for conducting disciplinary hearings against members of NHS Trust boards says that you can't have an investigation conducted by people that you work with, because obviously it's biased. However, it was the chief executive, that asked me to leave in the first place, who was conducting the, investigation into me. And that was completely against the rules. So the idea that the NHS, when it wants to get rid of someone, plays fairly is crazy. They just don't, and no one seems to be concerned about that. It was agreed that I had done nothing wrong. There was no question about my integrity or my ability to technically do the job. What they said was that I wasn't a team player. That was how it was expressed. You're not a team player. They said things like, when you meet with your executive colleagues, there's tension in the room. And I said, well, how does that manifest itself? Am I threatening people? Am I using inappropriate behaviour? No, none of that. You just create a tension with the views that you express. Because what I was saying was the tension comes because I'm telling the truth and other people don't want to hear it. What's the point of the NHS having rules that say how you will be treated if, when locally they're not applied, the people at the top of the organisation don't apply them? If they're not prepared to investigate wrongdoing, and the judge and jury are people that shouldn't be doing it, who would be exposed by all of this, the whole system is just a total shambles. And people don't, when you whistleblow, sort of all put their hands up and say, "Oh, good, I'm really glad you've exposed us." It isn't what happens at the end of the day in practice. These people know that if you succeed, they're going to lose their jobs. So, of course, they are fighting tooth and nail to try and, distort the outcome of these sorts of hearings. That's why it's so important that it's conducted by someone independent. If the NHS don't let that happen, what do you expect? The people I'm actually whistleblowing on are the people who are my judge and jury. Well, what's the only conclusion they can come? They're not going to say, well, Mr. Perkin, we're really grateful you've exposed all this wrongdoing, and we're all going to resign immediately, from our, 100,000 a year jobs. That's not what it's about. This is a sort of fight to the death at the end of the day in practical terms, and it's very difficult, I think, for people that expect justice to get sucked into that system and find how their how their rights are trampled all over, and those in authority don't really want whistleblowers at the end of the day. So they kind of turn a blind eye to bad practice. The real shock for me was when we got to the Employment Tribunal stage, because that really is when that sense of injustice hits you, that you think this is the point that you will reach, where you will get some fairness, and that isn't what happened. Only 3 people gave evidence to the Employment Tribunal on behalf of the NHS Trust. That was Miss McLaughlin, who was the chairman of the NHS internal hearing. It was Diane Mark, who was her sounding board, the other and Ian Hamilton, who was the chief executive who done the investigation. All these people who came forward to my internal, disciplinary hearing, where of course there were no proper rules of evidence or anything, none of those came to the Employment Tribunal to give evidence. So we couldn't cross-examine them and expose them in the way that we had at the internal hearing, because they weren't there. They weren't called by the NHS to give evidence. So, it was crazy. Whereas I had a whole raft of people who came forward. My solicitor gave evidence to the Employment Tribunal about what had happened at the internal hearing. My PA came to give evidence about my relationships with other directors. The head of information made a statement. The head of procurement made a statement. The head of computing made a statement. And the thing which was my sort of hold your breath and wait moment is that Kelly, the girl who was being bullied over the cancelled operations, she gave a statement. By the stage we got to the Employment Tribunal, I'd been out of work for a year from the NHS. Kelly was still working for the NHS. And when I phoned her, she was brilliant. She said, you know, no, you went to bat for me, don't worry, I'll give you a statement about what happened and how John Parks told me to alter these figures to zero. The last thing the NHS wanted to do was to have her turn up in court. So they acknowledged then that I had made a protected disclosure. So it was agreed I'd blown the whistle. So that Kelly never had to come and give evidence, because as soon as she wrote the sworn statement and signed it, the NHS capitulated. So for a year they had been saying I hadn't made the protected disclosure, you know. Changed their story then and said it was a red herring after that point to the Employment Tribunal. Now you would have thought at that point, I had friends, you know, emailing me and phoning me up saying, well, you've won this, and amazingly that wasn't the that wasn't the case. Because when we went to the Employment Tribunal, they just changed tack then and said, well, okay, he's blown the whistle, but it's a red herring. It had nothing to do with the fact that, you know, only 4 days later we fired him. Unrelated. And that's where my concerns come about the Public Interest Disclosure Act and the fact that people tell you that that protects you. Because if you read my judgment, which came out for the Employment Tribunal, it wasn't mentioned. It was mentioned in that, yes, I had blown the whistle, it says something along the lines, in the matter of cancelled operations, the respondent, that was the NHS, accept that, you know, that I had made a disclosure under the Public Interest Disclosure Act. But that was it. There's no other mention of it in the, you know, in the judgment at all. What I couldn't understand was, because the evidence was so overwhelming about all the NHS rules had not been followed, that the Employment Tribunal said, procedurally, it was quite clear I had been unfairly dismissed. But then what the Employment Tribunal did, they used a legal concept called pulky chance. And pulky chance means that they can consider what the result would have been had a fair hearing been conducted, and although it never was. So it's a really sort of fairy tale world that they inhabit. No fair hearing was held, but they say, as a tribunal, we're going to decide what we think the outcome would have been had a fair hearing, which wasn't held, actually been held. And they said from that they believed McLaughlin, Hamilton and Mark that I was a difficult person to deal with, and said I had made unfounded allegations against them, and that on that basis my unfounded allegations against my former colleagues had emphasised to them as a tribunal that I was an awkward person to deal with, and that I had conducted a defence which was too vigorous. And so on that basis that proved the point that I was an awkward person, and therefore, while I'd won the case, on pulky chance, which was how much compensation I should get, I shouldn't get any compensation because I was 100% to blame for my dismissal. That was the conclusion that they came to. So actually it was a waste of time going through it, because if that was right, there was no point in going forward. I had no rights at all because I was 100% to blame for everything that had happened. After that, I went to the House of Lords, but they said my case didn't raise any important points of public law, so they turned it down. So I ran it just about as far as I could. I would have taken it to European Court, but I had run out of money then, so I just couldn't get any further. When things go wrong, it is human nature for people to say they'd like to cover it up because they don't want to find it's their job that's on the line. And so until people really want an open culture, and sort of cases like mine don't happen, what's happening is that you get people who stand up and tell the truth, and then unfortunate things happen to them, and they've got a huge battle on their hands, to prove that what they said was correct, and not find that they get into court, with highly paid lawyers who, can obviously, to an ordinary, honest, hard-working individual, under cross-examination, prove that, what they were saying isn't in some way twisted, turned. It's what barristers do. That's what cross-examination is about. And people who aren't trained in that, will find it very, very difficult to stand their ground when they're one individual on their own and they're facing, the biggest employer in Western Europe who wishes to protect its reputation. I don't think it's very difficult to understand why that is the case. In terms of whistleblowing, it is a shock, and as I say, you do feel on your own. You're one individual fighting large organisation. People tell lies about you. It's an experience which is quite difficult. I remember when I got my Employment Tribunal judgment. You do need people to support you, because I couldn't believe it when I read it. That I'd won everything but got no compensation. So I'd lost my job, no compensation. Yeah, I proved the whistleblowing and I proved the unfair dismissal, and it was a bit of a shock. And my wife was very supportive then, and that was important, because you think the more important things, in life. So it gives you a sense of, because I think everybody has that moment of despair when they get that, and you either sink or you fight back. And I decided to sort of fight back. And looking back on it, you don't know it at the time. And I think that's the thing that all whistleblowers share. We all share that sense of desperation and unfairness when it happens. But now when I look back on it, it was a good experience for me, because at the end of the day, because I did push it all the way to the end, and as my barrister said to me, the High Court have said you're a man of integrity and honesty. You proved you've made a protected disclosure. You've fought a big organisation as long as you could. And you kind of come out with your integrity intact, and you're your own man. And I think that's the thing. No one's going to have sort of much of an emotional connection with you at the end of the day, but you're going to be going through a very emotional time. And I think what's really important, if you can, is get some legal protection insurance if you think you're likely to end up in a sort of in an organisation where this sort of thing might happen, because everyone will tell you you've got rights. People talk about Public Interest Disclosure Act and all sorts of other employment rights that you've got. But if you can't afford the money to actually employ the lawyers to exercise those rights, the reality is you haven't got any rights at all, and you will just be trampled on. And the thing is that I've found that other whistleblowers I've met who've had a bad experience when they've gone to employment tribunals and to court, they've expected justice, and they've come out like rabbits caught in the headlights, who've just been run over. They can't believe what's happened to them, and that there was no justice. It isn't about justice. It's about a game played by a set of rules, and if you can't afford people who know what those rules are, you're sunk.